So I want to go over this, and then we'll go over the theory and kind of tools that you'll need to make this work. Um, and then we'll ideally make an application with this. So there's two things that we'll kind of do once we get to actually using it. I want to create we'll create an application from scratch. It will be just a simple online chat room. That'll be the first thing we do. We also want to do a few things on the sports store, and that'll kind of help you move towards the stuff that I want you to do for the labs. One reason for doing that online chat room is it gives us a really good idea and insight to where this is really a must, because an online chat room is something you can't build without this, if that makes sense. Like with the tools that you have right now, that's not something you can actually build. So, what we want to talk about today is something called AJAX. It's an acronym for Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML, right? That's where the X comes from. Nowadays, we don't really use XML hardly at all, if ever, okay? So that last bit is really been replaced by something we call JSON, or JSON object notation, okay? Which we'll come back to in a bit, okay? So AJAX came on the scene really around 1999 is the first time that we saw it used. And originally it was something that Microsoft added into Internet Explorer, back around Internet Explorer 5.0. So it's been out there in the field and it's been used for quite a while. And it's actually something that's become really a fundamental tool in building modern apps, modern web apps. Because what it allows us to do is the big thing it allows us to do is it allows us to talk to the server without refreshing the page, right? Everything we do right now, we go to the server and then we grab a whole new page, right? Does that make sense? And that has a cost, right? Because it means that I have to generate everything on that page again. I can't easily just update part of it. I can't do a quick, like, hey, I just want to get this tiny piece of information and done, right? So it allows us to build applications that are much closer to maybe what you might have on a smartphone, running directly on a smartphone or running it directly on your laptop. Does that make sense? So it allows us to do a lot of those things. You do remember, ideally from your first semester, you did some stuff with jQuery, you did some stuff manipulating the DOM, right? So those are important tools in making this work, is because usually what we're going to do is we're going to send that request off to the server, and then we're going to manipulate the DOM with whatever we get back. Does that make sense? So we're going to do some dynamic updates in the page. So this will be a lot more JavaScript heavy than what we've seen so far. Does that make sense? We've done a lot of Razor. We're going to have some JavaScript now mixed in. Okay. So as far as where this AJAX is used, it's pretty important in a lot of different areas. So things like, hey, I want to check if your username or that email address is already in use, right? Whether you're changing it or whether you're registering a new account, right? You won't want to let you register an account if that email is already in use, right? So AJAX allows us, for one, to go check that immediately as you're typing it in and say, oh, okay, that's fine, it's not in use. Rather than forcing the user to wait till they submit the form to tell them, oh, sorry, go out to the back and pick a different email or pick a different username. So it's good for that. It's also really, really important as far as autocomplete functionality for search warrants. So like, you know, if I start typing in Google, it starts giving you some suggestions, right? Immediately. You've seen the autocomplete drop down. That is AJAX happening right there. Because notice that it's getting data from the server without refreshing the page. So that's one very important thing. So if we want to build really good search pages, we need to have that tool. We can also use it for spell checking, because a lot of that means go to the server, say, is this word correct or incorrect, and get back yes or no, or what are the suggestions for how you could spell it differently. So that's important as well. That spell checking does go into our factors into those search boxes, because we also want to usually give, in order to build a good search box, we need to do some spell checking on that search box. Progress bars for uploading anytime we want to upload a file, right? So the way we've set it up so far, you hit the save button and then you just wait till the browser's done, right? And then you see the page refresh, right? So you've seen a lot of upload pages, I'm sure, that you see some sort of progress bar that tells you where is it in the process of uploading that file, right? In order to actually build that progress bar, we're going to need AJAX. So that's another place. Contact us forms can also be a helpful place to do that, and especially the ones that you have on your portfolio where it's a one-page site, there's a lot of benefit to using AJAX there instead of just doing a form post. Likes, 5-star ratings, comments, all of that stuff is really a good place for these tools. Online chats, you've also seen Facebook's got continuous scrolling, Pinterest, same kind of thing where you just start scrolling and it keeps doing the paging, right? It does it automatically. All of those things are things that we need AJAX to do. Does that make sense? And I hope you can see that all of those things are things that you're seeing on most websites that are out there, okay? So it's a really important thing to understand and make use of, okay? So, and the other big thing that so not only does it allow us to do avoid the refresh, but because we're avoiding the refresh, we can now do animations, right? If we're changing the entire page, I can't animate that change. But if I'm doing the change in JavaScript and manipulating the DOM, I can now animate that change. That makes sense? So I can make it look a lot more user-friendly, a lot more slick by using this tool. Okay. One thing that often happens here is that we're going to now be bridging the worlds of C# and Razor and the worlds of JavaScript. And one thing to remember in that process, where does your C# code run? Does it run in the browser? It doesn't run in the browser. So it runs on the server, right? Your browser has no idea that that C# code was even there, right? Once it gets to the server, there is no more C#, there's no more Razor. So on that, all that code that we write in C#, Razor is happening on the server. All the code we write in JavaScript is having on the browser. Does that make sense? So we'll have some stuff here where it's a mingling of both, where we have a JavaScript, the script tag that's got both of those in it, and it will be important to keep track of what's running on the server, what's running on the browser, because it will impact how the code runs. Does that make sense?
So even the presentation logic doesn't run on the client side or browser?
Even the stuff that's, so Razor, right?
Okay.
Anything that's Razor or C# is running on the server. The fact that it's presentation logic doesn't mean which side the divide it happens on, right? So some of our presentation logic will be happening on the server, some of the presentation logic will be happening in the browser. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The views are still turned into HTML before they ever get to the browser.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. And that's an important thing that we have to kind of keep track of. Okay. So the original way to do this, okay, and using vanilla.js, what you use is something called the XML HTTP request object. That's the object that you need to use in vanilla.js to communicate with it. Okay. Hardly anybody does that. Hardly anybody will use that object directly. Partly because there's a lot of browser there's a browser compatibility issues, including the fact that when Internet Explorer originally introduced this, it was a different class. So if you're looking at versions I/E, you may be using an entirely different class because this didn't come up until later. Yeah.
It's kind of hard to read. Is that XML.HTTP request?
It's all one word.
Okay.
It's all one word. Again, if you want to get it and look at it on your screen, it's on that. Okay. It's on Inside Rankin. But it is all one word. Okay, and for short, we often call that the XHR object. Okay. So, pulling from the MDN, the Mozilla developer documentation, their kind of way of describing this is to say you use it to interact with servers, you can retrieve data from a URL without having to do a full page refresh, and this enables a web page to update just part of the page without disrupting what the user is doing. It's heavily used in AJAX programming, which is why we're talking about it now. But despite its name, despite it says XML HTTP request, you can actually use it to retrieve any kind of data, not just XML. It says that in its name because that was the original intent when Microsoft put it out there. But at this point, you can retrieve anything from the internet that you need to. Including images, including video files, including whatever you need to pull down. Okay. Now, again, because there is some browser compatibility problems, we generally avoid using that object directly. It's also quite a bit cumbersome to use, the way things have been named and such. So what we're going to use on top of that is we're actually going to use jQuery to do this AJAX work. There's another library out there that's the Google released not too long ago called Fetch, which some other people have been using, but we're going to stick with jQuery since you've already gotten some introduction to that, ideally. Okay, so everything that we do in AJAX, it's in jQuery is built on top of this function. This $.ajax, parentheses. Now, usually when we do stuff with jQuery, how does the jQuery statement usually start?
I believe it's $, and then parentheses with a selector.
Right, parentheses with a selector. So somebody give me an example selector. What might go in there?
ID.
Class.
A class?
So like dot, your class name.
Okay. Well, maybe I say, okay, my class.
And then can also select things related to it instead of thing itself.
But that's usually how it starts, right?
Yeah.
So when we're using this AJAX method, we don't actually start it with a selector. Okay? Because usually I'd say this dot HTML or whatever I want to do, I call a method off of that selector, right? When we're using these AJAX methods, it is really just a $sign dot AJAX. There is no selector there. Okay. Now, how does that work, right? Well, so in this case, so $sign is actually an object. It's actually the name of a variable, right? So that's what we call the jQuery object, is that $sign. Here we're calling it as a function. Here we're just treating it as an object and calling a method on it. Does that make sense? We'll see this more in depth, but that's the thing to remember. This doesn't actually use a selector. So there's a few methods in here in jQuery that don't actually use selectors. This is one of them. Okay. AJAX, the AJAX method is the most general. Again, everything runs on that. However, there are some shortcuts that we'll be using primarily. The two most used ones that we'll use is actually get and post, because this shortens the syntax by a bit to use this method or that method. So we'll see those instead. But there are cases where those don't have all the options, so we may need to fall back to the AJAX.
So had these little helper methods get and post not existed, would you have to specify with parameters?
Yeah, and we'll get to that when I talk about those two methods. But yeah, if you use the full AJAX method itself, you have to specify which method you're sending it as. So, yeah. So in jQuery, there is what we call the jQuery XML HTTP request object, which is actually basically a subclass of the one that your browser has, because it's got some additional functionality, and it's kind of meant to be hiding the details of how that XHR works differently on different browsers. So in some cases, it may be that you need to get to that, but the XHR, just know that the XHR object that you see in the jQuery documentation is a wrapper around, is basically a subclass of the actual XHR object. Does that make sense? If you ever need to get to it. Okay. Nowadays, that AJAX object implements something we call a promise. Okay. We probably haven't seen promises in JavaScript yet, for the most part. I think you did some stuff with Node, right? So, what is a promise?
It returns a resolve or a reject.
Okay. Well, it doesn't return.
Or it doesn't return it.
It calls it,
Yeah.
right? So a promise in JavaScript is a relatively new JavaScript concept. I think it was introduced originally in ES6 or ES7,
It was ES6.
so it's pretty new. But the idea is it's a way to run asynchronous JavaScript. Okay, so the way it works with a promise, typically, you'll say, hey, go do thing. And the point of that is this is asynchronous, which, remember, asynchronous means it can't return the value immediately, right? So I can't just say result equals do thing and then go deal with the result, right? So instead, I'm going to say do thing and then give it a method to call when it's done, when it's actually got the result. So I'm going to say done function so I could do something as simple as say console dot log done. So the point is I give it a function to run when it's actually done, when it actually has a result, right? So call it, do the thing, when it's done, call this function. The important thing to know, if I've got code down here, recognize that this code will run actually first before that function gets called. Does that make sense? So it doesn't actually run from top to bottom anymore.
So it's asynchronous?
It's asynchronous. It's asynchronous because that's what we call a callback. That callback gets called back at some later time. I also have another method that I have here, which will be fail. Fail is what is the callback that I give it when it doesn't succeed. That make sense? So if it fails to do whatever I told it to do, if there's an error, there's an exception of some sort, it'll call fail. And that's where we deal with the error, versus if it's done, that's what we do next. Does that make sense? The important thing to remember as you're writing this out, the code that you write down here, that's actually run before this is done. So pretty much we generally don't write here after we're calling a synchronous function. We generally don't write anything down beneath here. We just put everything we need to do in the callbacks. Does that make sense? So that's how that's going to structure out. Now the parameters that those two functions take in this case, the done method takes three things. So it takes data, text status, and this XHR object. Okay. So the data is what the server actually returned to us. Okay. For us, that'll actually be an object. That'll actually be the JSON that comes back. But it could also be HTML. It could be whatever, right? So this is whatever the server sent back. Text status, that tells us what status code the server returned. That's pretty much always going to be 200 OK. Okay, so but that's how we check if the status was something other than 200 OK. Okay. Then we also have the XHR object there if we need to do anything with it, which again is usually more advanced, such as dealing with headers or dealing with, hey, I want to show a progress bar, things like that. On the other, well, and that's also for logins, is the other place that's used. The fail side will give us again, the XHR object. It'll give us a text status. In that case, it's usually not going to be 200 OK. Usually it's going to be some sort of other error, whether it be a 400 error or a 500 error. And then there's potentially, if there was an exception thrown, we're going to see that as error thrown. So that's going to give us some more input about what actually went wrong. So we generally use those text status or the error thrown to show the user to say, here's what went wrong. Does that make sense? We failed to talk to the server, here's what went wrong. You can read more about this up at the API docs. I put a link there. That's where I've taken all this from with some minor tweaks. So let's talk about the get method. So the get method is really just a shorthand for calling AJAX with these parameters. So we set the type as get, and that's what we were talking about a minute ago. That's, if we were going to call the AJAX method, that's the big difference, is we're saying type get. Okay? And get only takes these 5 parameters. There's actually a lot more parameters that AJAX takes. I think it's somewhere on the order of 7 to 10 parameters. I'd have to actually go back and look at all of them. But for the most part, these are the only 5 that we send in most cases. So that's all that's there. So we've got the method is get. What's the URL? What data do you want to send to the server? What parameters do you need to send to the server? Like, what post ID are you looking for? Or what's the user ID that sent this? Or what's the full, hey, here's the comment I'm posting, right? Here's the body of the comment. So that data is all the data that we're sending to the server. Success would be the method that you want to call if it's successful. And data type is to give it some sort of hint as to what data type the response is. Does that make sense? So if we need to tell it that the data type is HTML or plain text or an audio file or something, we can tell it that, what data type to expect from the server. Because sometimes it needs to do something different. So, a few examples of how we might use this. If we just call it as such, $.get test PHP. Well, that's just going to go over to the server, ask for it, and not do anything with the results. Okay. I can also send a request and add some data. So here I'm sending data to the server. I'm saying, name is John, time is 2 p.m. So that data will go to whatever action method I have. Does that make sense? So those will be parameters into the action method.
Isn't it a get though? Why does it send data to the server if it's a get?
Well, imagine I want to get the details of a particular employee or product or whatever. Yeah, so it's, or if I want to search for, here's my keyword, or give me all the products in category X, right? So there's a lot of places, even with a get, where we're sending data.
Okay.
Similar thing, so this would be just to send individual parameters. I can actually also send arrays. So if I want to send an array of choices, I could say John and Susan, like that. If I want to actually do something with the response, I might set it up like this. So again, calling test PHP, say .done, and say alert, show the data in alert. Right? That's a good quick way to test things and just see what data you're actually getting back, is to just throw it in alert. Okay. Similar thing we can do here, same thing, but now we're passing parameters. So that's how that works out. So if I simply just want to get a single action method, I just write that. If I want to say, oh, we'll call the action method, and I also need to pass some data, it would look like so. If I want to do something a little bit more creative in my done method, I might say, okay, well, let's add this data that I get back to the body. So I'm going to say body, pen, and you see I'm grabbing the name, and I'm grabbing the time. So in this case, you can see the data is coming back as some sort of object with a property of name and a property of time. Does that make sense? Any questions there? So that's basically kind of a simple scenario of what that might look like as far as your JavaScript code is concerned. Okay. Now, obviously here, if I was going to write this in the real world, I need to put the URL to some sort of action there, right? So how might I do that?
So it would be an action in the controller.
The action in the controller is what I actually want to contact.
So you would use URL.action.
I would. So commonly what you're going to see here, .get, and what I actually put in those quotes would be something like at URL.action, and I might say, okay, well, let's go to the get product action. Okay. So I could call it like that. So you'll note that this part here, between these two outer quotes, right, that's in C#. Whereas the outer part is in JavaScript. So now I've mixed the two, right? So part of this line of code is C#, part of this line of code is in JavaScript, right? Now let's say I want to add some sort of product ID to this URL. Let's say the users, they've got 5 products on the page, and they want to click one. Clicking on the one of them gives me more details about the product, right? Well, in there somehow, I need to specify which product ID I'm looking at. So I've got 2 ways I could do that. So what happens if I what happens if I write it a little bit like, I must not curly brace.
Are those route values?
That'd be route values.
Well, wouldn't,
Huh?
What? Couldn't you just use the
I could. I've got 2 options here. What happens if I do this one? If I do this one, the product ID is being figured out on the server side, right? So if I use route values, it's going to figure out that ID, those data are going to be on the server side, right? So I can do that. If I know it if I know those inputs on the server side, I could potentially do that. But more often than not, your inputs are going to be, well, you're not going to know them until the user clicks on the thing, right? So most of the time, we're going to need to do that actually do that in JavaScript. So if I want to put that value in JavaScript, and then this would be curly brace.
So the top one wouldn't execute until,
So the top one, I'm picking these route values on the server side, right? This side, I'm picking the route values on the client side, on the browser. That make sense?
so like the second the user does something, that one will.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then I can do in JavaScript, I can figure out what that value is and toss it in there.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? So the latter one is usually what you're going to see. You can actually combine the two because it may be that sometimes you know some values on the server and then you don't, and then you know some of the other values when it actually gets to the user interacting with it. So you may actually see both sometimes. That makes sense? A mix of both, where you have some route values and you have some parameters. But the latter one is usually what you want to do. And that's sometimes what trips students up on this front, is they try to put it in route values and have that product ID there be, well, this is a C# variable, right? That top one, product ID, is a C# variable. This bottom one, product ID, is a JavaScript variable. Yeah.
Since you're using Razor syntax, can you only include that on the CS/HTML page and you can't use an external JavaScript file?
Correct. Yeah. So if you use an external like a .js file, that has to be strictly JavaScript. So the only place where I can intermingle those two is within a view. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So within a view, I can intermingle those two things, but I can't intermingle those two things if I shove it off as a separate script.
So you would have these in script tags and the...
Yeah, so it's pretty frequently here that we're going to end up with script tags that are specific to this view. Does that make sense? So we might have a main.js that's general, like, hey, we use that across the entire website, and maybe we can put some standardized functions out there, or we can put some code on the actual view that calls those functions. But at some point, we need to have specialized JS, usually on a per page basis. Okay. Post is very similar. The only difference here with this shorthand is that it's going to set the type to post. So .get sets the type to get, .post sets the type to post. Other than that, they are the same thing. So I can say, okay, I want to post data and then do something when it's done. So I'd say post it to the URL, done, run this code. I can also, again, post it, pass some additional data. I can post it and go manipulate the body, right? So there is an example here on, I'm going to go to the actual page. It's a little bit longer than I wanted to directly include here. So at the bottom of this page, they give you kind of some example code. And this is pure just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There's no C# in here. So if we look at it, we've got a form called search form. It's got a text input, and it's got a submit button, right? So that's what the form's here. Okay. If we look at here, let's see if I get anything back for that. Right? So I can type something in the box, and then it'll say, here's the search results. So that's what this is set up with. So if we look here, so it's handling the submit button of the search form. Again, it was ID search form up there. So we're saying when that submits, prevent the default. Don't do the normal default action of submitting this, because instead we're going to submit it through AJAX. Instead of doing a normal form post, we're going to post it ourselves. So we want to prevent it from doing anything. So that's a normal kind of thing to do. Anytime you have a form that you're working with jQuery, first thing you want to do is prevent the default action. Okay. So then we're going through the form. We create this variable called $form, and then we pull out what's the what did you enter in the search box, and what's the URL that's here. You see that? So we're grabbing the action method, the action property from the form, and we're finding the input tag that's inside with name this. Okay, once we have that, here's where we actually call .post. So we're going to post it to this slash here, we're going to post it to the root, we're going to pass in as S, we're going to pass in the value that was in that search box. Okay. So here's their URL, there's that. This actually returns a promise, which is why we can call methods on it, the done and the fail, like it was a promise. But we can also actually just directly save it to a variable if we would so need to. So they're saving it to variable and then calling done on it. So we're saying when it's done, go grab the data, which actually the data is coming back as an HTML page. So we're actually taking that data, which is a string, and by using this $ parenthesis here, that turns it into an actual DOM object. That takes it from being a string, which has HTML, to an actual DOM object. Which means that now we can call another jQuery selector on it, and we can say, okay, I don't want the entire page, I just want ID content from that page. So I'm going to just grab the content from that page, and then I'm going to throw it into this result tag, which I have defined here. So that's where my results are going to go. So I replace the results, I say empty it, and then add that content in. Okay, so there's a few things going on there. Are there any questions? Do you see what's happening there? So we're getting an HTML page, and then we're just showing part of it.
Can we go over the var $form equals $this?
This?
Yeah.
Okay. So here they're actually creating 3 different variables. I would strongly recommend against doing this. I would say var, var, var. You know, create those as 3 separate lines rather than trying to do that all in one line. But they're just calling this variable $form. So that's the actual name of the variable, because JavaScript variables are allowed to have $signs in them. That's not anything like jQuery specific.
Okay.
That's just the name of the variable. I could have just called it form instead of $form.
Is there a reason to do that? Put $signs in?
It's jQuery.
This is just whoever wrote the example wrote it that way. If it was me, I would just written as form instead of $form. But what we're doing here, this, what does that refer back to?
Is it whatever started the action?
So whenever you write a handler, remember, so we're writing submit,
Yeah.
so that'll be the form that just got submitted,
Yeah.
right? If this was .click, it would be the button or the link that you just clicked on, right? So this, in this sense, is whatever you interacted with, which in this case would be the form. So that means that's the actual HTML, the DOM model object. By putting these $paren around it, what we're doing is we're wrapping that DOM object in a jQuery object, which means we can call all the jQuery methods on it. If I just directly interact with this is just a vanilla JS DOM object. Once you wrap it around this, it's a jQuery DOM object. Does that make sense? That's what gets us from the vanilla JS world to the jQuery world. And then we're just calling the jQuery methods here, which is the find, which says find something that's a descendant, and then we're saying, hey, give me the value of that input, which is what the user actually typed in, because this just gives me the DOM object. That actually gives me the string that's in there.
What is that syntax? Input? Is that like a...
That's a selector.
Oh,
so
it's
it's
all
a
the
selector.
input
Yeah, that
tags.
whole thing's a selector.
Okay.
So input is the type of tag, right? So it's
Right.
an input and then it says, give me the input with name S,
Right.
which is
Okay,
right
I
there,
remember
right? So this is what we call an attribute selector. That part in the square brackets is what we call an attribute selector. Give me the input with name S. And then this just says, give me the attribute of that tag. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Down below where it's saying data.find, the content ID.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Where's that coming from?
Okay, so let's inspect this a little bit. So you saw me kind of run through there. I'm going to hit F12, which is going to bring up the developer tools. And specifically, I'm going to go and look at the network tab. Okay, network tab's really helpful when we're doing this AJAX stuff because we're not posting a new page. The only way for us to see what's going back and forth sometimes is to look at the network tab to see what actually got sent to the server and what actually we got back. So let's say I say bling and hit enter. You can see over here we went to api.jquery. You can see the URL we went to. You can see that we posted. And let me see. So here's the page. Where? There. Okay. So here's the whole page that came back. Basically, we got the whole home page of api.jquery.com, which is an entire HTML document like this, and we just grabbed part of it. So if we look for ID equals content, there it is. So that would be anything inside that tag. Or if I go back and look back at Kayak, we'll run that again and you'll see it. Oh, go back in there. And get something smaller because that actually gave us search results. So there's that. And we can see here it says like search results Kayak. And we can also look at the headers section here and we can see what we actually sent to the server, right? So S:\kayak, there down at the bottom under form data, that's the data actually sent to the server. Does that make sense? So you can use that network tab to see what URL did I go to, what method did I go as, which should be up here as post. And I can also see what data I sent to the server and how it was sent. Does that answer that question? So what I'm getting back is an entire page, and I'm just asking for part of that page.
So does that mean we don't have to really use a form? We can just use the jQuery get without like actually using a form?
Notice that there's still a form here.
But can we still use it without a form?
You can technically, yes, you can use it without a form.
Like
Yeah.
say if it's like a like button or something.
Yes.
Or like
Yeah, like buttons we can do without a form. We could just make it a button without a form and have that be. General word of caution there though, it's generally recommended to have a form anyway. The reason being, that way you have a fallback if for some reason they have JavaScript turned off. Right, so a form tag, right, works without JavaScript. It works just fine. But if we don't include that form, now that button just doesn't do anything that like button just doesn't do anything for somebody who has JavaScript turned off. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if I use that form tag, I can make it work for both people that have JavaScript enabled and people that don't. So I'm usually going to use both. I'm going to set it up so it can work without having the jQuery there. Although there are cases, there's plenty of cases where it's like, well, this is, the only way to really do this is AJAX. But ideally, you don't want to have that. So that's what it looks like as far as the jQuery is concerned. The two methods you need to know about are the get method and the post method. And you may occasionally run into the AJAX. There's also a method called load. And load, unlike the other two, runs off a selector. And what it says is, okay, give me this, let's say result, I want to say .load. It'll actually load this page and put it into the contents of that page and put it in there. So that's if you're working with like partial views and HTML as you're getting back. But primarily what we're going to use is going to be JSON is what's going to come back, which JSON we can't directly just put in with this load. So we'll see post and get. There's some more links here to follow up on all these methods because there's some really good documentation about the different methods that's in there. If you go here and look at deferred object, that will tell you everything about that object. A lot of the things more about that object that actually comes back when I call get, post, AJAX. They'll tell me what methods that has. You can look at the done method, you can look at the fail method, you can see how those kind of work. Okay, so as we kind of mentioned previously, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to have page-specific JavaScript, right, which we haven't done yet. And if I just put my JavaScript into the view, right, if I just put my JavaScript directly into the view, where is it going to be relative to my jQuery scripts and such, and my Bootstrap scripts?
Only in that page.
Well, it's going to be on that page, but where is it going to be? It's going to be above it, right? So I'm going to have, if we remember, there's render body is in our layout, and then that's kind of in the middle of the page, though, right? That's in the middle of our layout file. I might have my footer, but it's not all the way at the end of the body, which is where we have our JavaScript files, right? So if I just put it in there, I'll have the content on my view. I'll have the script for my view. And okay, that's not working well. Right? And then all the way down here, I'll have, okay, bring in jQuery. So if this script up here is using jQuery, what kind of error are you going to get?
Syntax errors, I think, because you'll be using the jQuery.
You'll be using the $sign.
Yeah.
It'll, if you have it set up this way, it'll say, I don't know what this $sign object is.
Yeah.
And we'll completely ignore all the JavaScript that you just wrote. It won't do anything with it. It'll just say, oh, I can't do that because $sign doesn't exist. $sign is null.
Is that considered a syntax error?
It would be considered a runtime error because you don't necessarily have to declare all of your objects in JavaScript beforehand, remember?
Oh yeah, so it will
So it's not technically a syntax error, it's just it's a runtime error because that object's undefined.
So it'll still compile.
It'll still compile just fine, but once you tell it to run, the first line it hits with the $sign, it's going to say, oh, $sign's undefined, I can't run your code, right? So what do we need to do? We need to take this script that we've got specific to that view, and we need to move it underneath. We need to move it all the way down to the bottom of the land. Does that make sense? Okay. With the tools that you've been given so far, you cannot do that. There is no way. Okay. But my goal is to take this and put it down here. Okay. So there's a tool in Razor called sections, okay? And I can actually have a bunch of different sections in my layout. The way I define, hey, I've got a section, is in my layout, I'll write this. I'll say render section, what's the name of the section, and is it required or not? If it's required, then every view has to give me that section. Every view has to include that section. But for this, not all pages are going to have JavaScript. So I only want to have that in some. So at the end of my layout, after all the scripts, I'm going to add this. I'm going to say render section scripts, and that's going to render this page-specific portion of that out there. So that's the part I put in my layout. Okay, the part I put into my view looks like this. So I start it with @section, and then I say, what is the name of that section? So the name of the section is scripts, and this I could put anywhere in my view. It can be the top, the bottom, it doesn't matter. But whatever I put between this, @section scripts, between this curly brace and that curly brace, will get put at this point in the layout. So rather than getting put where render body is, it gets put where this render section is. So that's what I can use to get my scripts to render in the right place. Rather than rendering immediately at the end of the view, still in the main tag, I'm going to use that to get my scripts to be down at the end of the body. One other place that this can be used is, let's say you have a section in your layout where you want to have a sidebar that some pages might have and some pages might not. And different pages might have a different sidebar. This is the same thing. So they'd say this is section sidebar. Does that make sense? So you can use this for a lot of things, actually. But the one that you definitely need it for is for the scripts section. So that allows us to put custom scripts, every different view. It also, this is what now allows us, because it's in the view, we can intermingle that C# and that JavaScript code in one place. Okay, but the thing to remember there again, as I mentioned earlier, remember that your C# runs on the server and your JavaScript runs on the browser. Okay, and you have to kind of watch and see which one is it, right? And remember that because those are running in two different places, your JavaScript cannot access your variables in C#. Your C# cannot access your JavaScript variables. It doesn't have access to either of those because they're running in two completely different places. So you might have a variable called product ID or yada yada or foobar, right? If you have foobar in C#, that doesn't mean you have a foobar variable in JavaScript. So let's take a pause here and come back at 1:45. Hey Ben, I think I've got a resume from, I think I don't have your resume yet. I think I've got everybody else's.
It's on my drive now, it might be on my OneDrive or my Partner OneDrive, I'm not sure.
PDF's referred, so if you go into Word. So
did it.
You already saved it. Already being down this folder. She was told to export share.
It's a PDC.
P.R. Smith. Did it go through, Ben? Hey, Ben. Hey, Ben. Did it go through?
Yeah.
Because I didn't get it. Oh, there it goes.
Or she was.
Mr. Smith,
Mm-hmm.
who is on the other end of the chat with us now that can unrank it?
What? I don't know. I don't know what that is.
Comes out somewhere?
That got miraculously added. I have no idea what it's about.
Yeah. You can't hang up. Dude, you can't hang up, bro. That's why I wanted to go. I'm sorry, alright. I got it.
I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if that's part of Genzabar or if that's part of Rankin system. I don't know where that's actually connecting to. Okay, so far we've talked about a few different things regarding AJAX. Okay, just as a quick refresher, who can tell me what that acronym stands for? What does AJAX stand for?
Asynchronous.
Asynchronous JavaScript.
And previously XML, but now
Yeah.
JSON.
So asynchronous JavaScript and XML is the name of the acronym. What is the reason that we need this tool? What is this tool going to help us with?
Getting data from the database without refreshing the page.
Right. Yeah. Or any other data. It doesn't have to come from the database, actually. It could be coming from other sources, right? This could be reading a file or getting something from disk. It can be all sorts of things, right? It could be even downloading images, if for some reason you need to download an image from somewhere. But the point is, yes, to get data or get something from the server without refreshing the page entirely. Okay, so we looked at what we need to do to get their custom JavaScript in on a per page basis, and that's going to be these sections. The next thing we want to look at is how do we actually set this up on the controller side so that we're returning JSON data. So we've already seen how to return HTML, right? So if I want to return HTML, let's say I've got this method view. I want to view details about a single product, so I give it the product ID. I go say, okay, product singular default. So this will give me, grab that product based on the product ID, and then we'll just render the view with that, right? So we've seen that, and that's going to render HTML, right? So to work with AJAX, however, rather than rendering HTML, I'd like to render a JSON object, okay? And the way I do that is as simple as this. So rather than calling view, I call JSON. I call JSON, I give it whatever object I want it to render, and then if I want it to be accessible via get, then I say JSON request behavior allow get, because by default it gives you an error on get. On post, you don't have to do that. That's just if you want it to be accessible over get. Okay. The reason that it does that is to avoid something called cross-site scripting, where one website is calling your services that you're exposing, maybe without permission. So that's why that's there, is to try and block some of those exploits that can happen if get is open. Okay, so that's there. Another thing that commonly happens, let's say I just have this here. If I leave that as is, depending on the navigation properties that my product has, this might get me an error because of circular references. Where, okay, so I've got, let's say I've got my order line, right? I've got my order lines connected to this product, which is, hey, these users have started to order this product. Well, okay, so in my product I have a list of product lines, order lines, and in my order line I've got a navigation property back to product, right? So I have a navigation property going both ways. Well, when this tries to go through and turn it into a JSON object, it will say, okay, I'll follow that list, and then I'll follow that single, and then I'll follow that list, and then I'll follow that single, and, well, you can see where that becomes a problem, right? So if we have those navigation properties there, that can be a problem for it turning it into JSON. So one way to work around that is that we add the script ignore attribute. This is a new attribute. We add that to the navigation properties, and that means when you go and try to turn this into JSON, pretend that navigation property isn't there. So don't follow it. Don't include that data. Does that make sense? So I can add that whether it's a single, like this, it just belongs, product belongs to a single category, or I can add it if there's multiple, where the product might be in multiple order lines. And that just says, don't include that in the JSON when you. More often though, usually if we're sending back JSON, there's a good chance that we'll end up needing a view model that we return, rather than returning the actual model object itself. And that's the other way to get around this. Does that make sense? So that's the thing to know, because that's the thing that will usually trip you up. Now, so I said this returns the object now as JSON, right? So it returns it as JSON instead of HTML. Okay. You may have seen JSON before, you may have not. What it looks like, here's an example of a JSON document. So you can see, and you may have to look at this as your own screen, because I think, actually, let me see if I can blow this up. Yeah, there we go. So what you see on the outer side here, you see that there's a curly brace here, curly brace there. So curly brace means that this is the start and the end of an object. That's how you define an object. Square brackets, like you see here, means that it's an array. So curly brace means it's an object, square brackets means it's an array. So here I have an object which represents a person, right, or an employee, and I can say, okay, so their first name is John, last name is Smith, is alive. I can include booleans, so this is how it includes string values, booleans. I can have integers, so like age 27. Say I could already also do floating point numbers that way as well. So that gives me a basic way. Here's the name of the property, here's the value. If I want to define, I can also nest things. So like this address is an object in and of itself, right? It's not a single thing. So this address has 4 properties, which is that street address, city, and postal code. So I've got an object inside of an object. Okay? I can also include arrays inside of that object. So phone numbers here is an array of 3 phone numbers. Each of those being objects in themselves. So you've got a phone number which has a type and a number. You had a hand up?
No, I just figured that out, sorry.
Okay. So I can specify that out, true and false. I can have numbers. I could also have like an empty array here because these got no children. Or I can say, hey, spouses is null. So I can specify nulls in there as well if I need to. That's what JSON looks like. Okay. It's very, very short. It's very lightweight. It's very easy, it's very, very easy to implement, right? Because there's just not much to the syntax. So it used to be back in the day that we would send most of our data for things like this. For AJAX, we'd send it over XML, right? And we've pretty much universally switched over to using this sort of format because it is much simpler and it's a lot easier, right? So if I were to compare this same document, right, and write it in XML, I hope you've seen XML. XML is basically like HTML. It's just more general. I have a tag up here, right, that would say person, and I have a closing tag here, person, right? Well, even just by doing that, how many characters did I have to use just for the opening tag?
8.
I already had to use 8 characters. Okay, so I already saved 7 characters there, and I saved 8 characters here. Right, so it's a lot less characters that I have to type in. The other thing that happens with XML, and this is one of the things that gets the most painful, remember in HTML or XML, you can have objects and you can have tags inside of other tags, right? You can also have attributes. So somebody who's defining the schema in XML, there's 2 different ways to define this address. You could say, all right, I'm going to have an address tag, and all 4 of these are attributes of that address tag. Or I could say, I'm going to have the address tag, I'm going to have 4 tags inside of it. Well, if we're dealing with XML, we have to handle both of those cases. And we literally have to write code for both of those things, which is one of the reasons why we shifted away from that. Does that make sense? So, it takes up a lot less space, and it also means that there's only one way to represent it. Is it an array or is it a list? I mean, because is it an array or is it an object? Because that's really everything that we have in the programming world pretty much boils down to that. Either an array or an object.
Aren't the web config files written in XML?
They are. But that's with, so that's with the .NET framework version still of ASP.NET MVC. There's another version of ASP.NET called Core, which is actually if I remember right, those have switched over to being the config files being in Java JSON.
Yeah, they are.
So, but for right now, yes, what we're looking at, what we're working with, those config files are in XML. But yeah, so we've switched. Most of the industry switched over to that. That's just they've had that system in place for such a long time. It just took them a long time to make that switch. overhaul their config files to be JSON files. So that's what that looks like. As far as actual history of JSON goes, it came up around the early 2000s, and at that point kind of quickly overtook XML, which for timing space, think about that. We got this XHR object in 1999 originally, and JSON started kind of becoming a popular thing early 2000s. There's only a very small, less than a decade, where we actually used XML with this XHR object. So most of its lifetime, we've actually used JSON for it. This JSON syntax originally kind of came up as it's a subset of actually the JavaScript programming language, because you can actually write objects like this in JavaScript. You can actually create objects just anonymously like that in JavaScript, and it's a very useful tool. So that's part of where that came up with. It's kind of it's gone a different direction now, because what's valid in JavaScript, well, I say it's a subset because what's valid in JavaScript isn't necessarily valid JSON. If that makes sense. So there's a few different ways that you can write it in JavaScript that aren't actually valid JSON. So JSON's a little bit more strict than what JavaScript allows you. But that's where it comes up. Now, again, the name JSON comes from JavaScript object notation. That's where that acronym comes from. But it's not anymore as it's specific to JavaScript. In fact, JSON is used with pretty much any major language now. All of the major languages have a library that you can work with JSON, because it's such a popular thing. So it's a really good thing to learn because, again, it's used pretty much everywhere now. It doesn't matter which technology you're working with, you're likely to run into JSON. Okay. If you want to read the official spec on there, there's json.org is where the official spec is. There's also a Wikipedia article that has a little bit on it as well. So that's what you were going to get out. So let's say we write that as, hey, return JSON. This is what you're going to see as the result. Rather than seeing an HTML document, this is what we're going to see. So the upside of that is this is really, really nice to work with in code, and it takes up a lot less bandwidth to send these things back and forth, but it's not something I can send directly to the user. It means that once I get this object back, now I have to do my own custom logic to show it to the user, to present to the user the information that they need to see. Okay. So, a little bit of a terminology. Web services, API endpoints. A web service is specifically defined as a service that's offered by one application to another application. It's a typical definition of a web service. So let's say I have my website and I want to expose, hey, I want to expose like, hey, you want to search my list of movies that I have? Well, here's my web service. Use this URL, right? But we also use this within our own applications. And that's where we're going to see this. This is even within our own application. We're going to build these web services in our controller, and then we'll use them in our own views. Okay. So the action methods, if we write action methods like that, where it returns JSON at the end, that's what I would consider a web service. Another word for it is an API endpoint. So both of those words apply. If you have an action method that returns JSON, you've just written your first web service. Simple as that. And I say that specifically because they're returning unformatted data that we're using in our code. It's not stuff we're showing directly to the user. It's, hey, my code's going to use this special function. Okay. Another term that we talk about, web APIs. The term API, or Application Programming Interface, actually goes back a long way. all the way back to before we really had objects or we really had internet. It goes back to the days when we just had functions, right? So the basic definition of an application programming interface, an API, is that it is just a set of functions. That's originally all it was, because that's all we had. An API was a set of functions. And then we got objects, right? And objects and classes. And then an API became a set of classes and functions, because now we have other things that we might want to put in an API. And then, well, the internet came along, and this thing AJAX came along, and now we have like, okay, well, now we have sort of functions we can call on the internet, which are these action methods that return JSON. They're sort of what we call, they're sort of like functions. They take inputs, they give you an output, okay? So nowadays what we say, if you hear the term API, usually they're talking about a web API, which the definition there, well, an API is a set of API endpoints. So just like we originally defined the API as a set of functions, and you'll still see that usage, an API, if you're hearing that, is usually a set of API endpoints or a set of web services. Okay? So every API endpoint has a few things. To define an API endpoint, it's got a URL that I can access it by, a method, an HTTP method that I can access it by, such as get or post. There's also a few other ones that are available, which are put and delete. So it can't actually be any of those four. It can be get, post, put, or delete. So we define that as part of the endpoint. And we also say what parameters does it accept. Okay, what parameters does it accept and what does it return? Which basically, if you think about that, it's basically a function. Right? So an API endpoint, you can kind of think about it, it's a function that you can call on the internet. Right? So it may be to your own server, it may be to somebody else's server. Okay? Questions on that?
I usually see like APIs like on subdomains. So
Okay, yep,
how,
that happens often.
how would that work when you have, would you have it on another server, or would you have it on the same server?
So when I have a subdomain, that's effectively a whole nother website, right? So you have a domain name. So for instance, if I say jquery.com, right, that's the domain name. If I say code.jquery.com, that would be the subdomain, would be the code subdomain. Those are actually two completely different websites. So, or api.jquery.com. api.jquery.com is a completely separate website from code.jquery.com. Does that help? So because it's a completely separate website, well, that website might be running on the same hardware. It might be running on two different machines. Doesn't matter. By having a domain name, remember that domain name matches up to an IP address. So it may be that the IP address for both of those are the same. It might be that they're different. It depends on who's running the server. That makes sense? So but a different domain is a different application.
So overall, would it be okay to have them both on the same server?
Yes, you can. In fact, if you remember right, when we create projects, when we create our projects in Visual Studio, remember usually there's some checkboxes there? So we've been starting with an empty project and we've checked so far the MVC checkbox. Remember that there's another checkbox in there? Remember there's a Web API checkbox? Well, there's another kind of setup that we can just build these web services. We can build them with our controllers that we're used to. But there's also something that Microsoft's made in there, which is the base of it is the API controller. So API controllers and controllers work a little bit different. They're very similar, but there's a lot of differences between them. An API controller only returns XML or JSON. It can't ever return views, versus our controllers can return anything. So oftentimes what people do with ASP.NET is they'll have their core website just kind of at the root, and then they'll do /API, and that will be where all their API controllers live. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So we actually normally with MVC will usually host those in the same website. You don't have to. You can make those two completely separate websites, but it's pretty normal to have those in the same place, at least to start out. If you have a lot of bandwidth that ends up getting devoted to your API, that's where you start breaking it off into other servers, right? If your API is getting a lot more usage than your regular website, which means like a lot more people are using your website indirectly, right? So like you think maybe Twitter, maybe people are showing accessing posts and posting posts on other websites. Well, that would be a good place to start moving it separate. So it all depends on what your load is. Okay. So one way to structure APIs, you can really structure APIs any way you want. There is no restriction about that. But a popular way to structure APIs now is what we call as RESTful APIs. Okay? And what RESTful APIs do is we take CRUD and we map it to those different HTTP methods. So remember that I said there's 4 different HTTP methods. There's GET, there's POST, there's PUT, and there's delete. So what we do is we say, well, GET, that's going to be our read. If you say GET, that's to read data. POST would be to insert data. PUT would be to edit or update data. And delete is, well, to delete data. And what that does is it makes for a very simple, streamlined, okay, I know exactly how to use this interface, use this API without having to learn very much about it. So let's say I want to work with products. My first API endpoint might be, I say, well, get/product. Well, that would get me all the products. I could add additional parameters to that to do searching or paging and all those things. But the basic definition there is if I say /product, that will now return all the products in the system. Okay? If I want a specific product, then I say product/5 or product/ID number, whatever. So if I say product/5, that will give me just product 5. So I might set this up to just give me a summary, just give me part of the information about all the products, just to save on bandwidth. And then I might say, hey, well, after product 5, and I'll give you everything about product 5. Does that make sense? So this is kind of your index page. And there's your kind of view or your details page. It tells you more about that. And then if I want to insert a product, I say post to /product, right? So just like I can say get product lets me do a read, this now lets me do an insert. Yep.
So what file would this go in? Would this
So
kind of go in?
I haven't gotten to that yet.
Okay.
But the way I set this up is going to be through controllers. Okay? So if I'm using an API controller, this would actually be like /API/product, /API/product is where it would start. But if I'm starting with this as a controller, well, you could kind of think about it, this would probably be the product controller, is where I would start that with. You'll notice in here I don't have an action method, so it isn't necessarily the way I'm going to set it up. I'm going to maybe do something similar, but not exactly like that. But this is how we might set up a RESTful API. So this isn't going to be exactly how we set it up, but it's going to be similar, because we still want to kind of borrow some of those principles. Does that make sense? But that's the idea. So post is hey, I want to create a new product. Put, if I say put product 5, I'm now making changes to a product. I'm now editing it or writing an update statement. And then if I want to delete it, then I just say delete product number 5. So that makes sense? Just by setting that up that way, I can just say, what do I want to change, and give me the ID for it, and you can just figure out what it's supposed to do based on the method. Does that make sense? And that's usually the way we structure things. So when we go through here, you'll see maybe some of that, but that's the way I would stress to kind of, as close you can get to that, even if it's not exact, easier it's gonna be to kind of explain that to somebody else, or share that with somebody else. A common tool that we use once we get into building RESTful APIs like this, we generally can't just test them through Chrome. Because if we're just testing them through Chrome, all we can get to is get. That's all we can access, the get method. I can type in the URL to it, and it's going to go through as a get request. To get through all this other part, the other 3 parts here of that, and as well as to deal with some authentication things, we can't do that directly through testing in the browser. So once we need to test with that, Postman is a common tool that's used, a popular tool that's used in the industry to do that testing, right? So if we want to say, hey, I want to test what that does, I can then go type in the URL, tell it what action method, give it the headers that I need, things like that, give it all the parameters, and say go, and it'll actually go run it against the server, and I can see if it's actually working. So that lets me test a lot of things without my JavaScript involved, without jQuery involved, without having the front end there. I can make sure that it's still that it's working the way I want it to. So it's a very, very helpful tool. Okay. While we're at it, because we're going to want this tool, let's go ahead and get you started on it. So what you want to do is go to getpostman.com. They have a few different ways to access this and use it. They have a web interface. They also used to have a Chrome plugin. The Chrome plugin's no longer supported. But the one we want to use, which is the one they recommend at the moment, is to go get the Windows app. So if you go to getpostman.com, we're going to say download the app. And here I'm going to grab the 64-bit version of Postman. So for now, I just want to get it installed and make sure you have an account. Once we actually have some code, then we can start use this and test our code with it. Okay, I am going to create, so once you get it up and running, you should see something like this. I'm going to say create a new collection, and maybe I say Chatterbox create. Now one thing you may want to do so that you can access these and share them across different computers if you would so need, you may actually want to go sign in and create an account. I would recommend going through that process. So you can do a lot of things without actually being signed up, but once you get signed up, then it'll start saving some of these endpoints that you've already kind of configured for across your machines. Okay. So that's kind of the lowdown from the theory side. So we've talked about all the tools that we kind of need to get going. Obviously in here we're going to be using jQuery.
To set up the workspace, which ones do I select?
Just hit on collection. Wait, did you download the app?
Yeah. What I'm doing, that's what I'm
Just
saying.
say set up later.
Is there a way to like search for your name and share a link or something?
I'm not sure. I haven't really messed around with that. There may be.
Did you say, you wanted us to add your email on this setup? Or is it something different?
Yeah, just get that. Yeah, just get that. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the tools that we need to make this happen. We've talked about what it is and what it does for us. We've talked about JSON. We've talked about some of the history that goes into this. Again, this has been around this started in early 2000s. This has become a really, really important part. Unfortunately, I haven't really found a good textbook that talks about it, for the most part, especially as ASP.NET is concerned. It's definitely a lot more prominent if you're working with Node. But there's not necessarily a whole bunch of tutorials and stuff out there about it. So, what we want to sit down and do next is actually start building up that online chat room. That's where I want to start. Okay, so I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and I want to just create the project, and then we'll go on break from there. But I want to just create the empty project first. So I'm going to say create a new project. As usual, this is going to be a .NET application there.
So what is the big difference between MVC Core?
Wait, so ASP.NET project, you said?
Yes. Yeah. So Core is something that's Microsoft, it's a completely rebuild of everything, and it's open sourced, whereas .NET Framework, the one that's based on .NET Framework, is not open sourced. It's strictly Microsoft, has to be run on a Windows machine.
Okay. Is this Unit 4?
Yeah, so this will be Unit 4. Let me find desktop, yeah. So we're going to go over Labs Unit 4. So I'm going to call this project Chatterbox is the name I'm going to give this project. Same thing for the solution. I'm going to make both of those Chatterbox.
Did you capitalize the B?
I did not. I just capitalized the C.
Also, Chatterbox is 2 T's.
Oh.
Now would that affect, because you called it 1 T in the app, or the
Uh-huh.
Postman app?
Oh, that's fine. Doesn't matter. And I can go rename that. So I'm going to hit create. So again, we're going to go to empty. I'm going to check MVC. I'm going to go ahead and check Web API, just so we can look at it. So we're going to create with both of those things. You can add the other you can add the other one of those if you don't check both of those initially. Basically, you just have to install the right NuGet package, and you get the NuGet package or two, and you have the other side of that. So we've got this project created. Obviously, the next thing we want to do is add the database project. So I'm going to add a new project, SQL Server database, and I'm going to call this the Chatterbox database. Okay, so I want to create some folders there. So I'm going to say add new folder. I need one for publish, and I need one for my tables. So that's where we're starting. We want to go ahead and give you a chance to take a break. So come back at 2:40. Once you've got this done, you can come back at 2:40 and we'll actually start building this application.
This might be a dumb question, but, so there's a difference, so you go to like facebook.com through Chrome,
Okay.
versus like the Facebook app.
Okay.
I guess is that kind of, going through Chrome be like an API of Facebook?
They're going through the app.
No, it's going
In fact, they're both using the API.
Oh,
They're both using the API. So you've got the app, right? It's got the UI components. But imagine if imagine what would happen if you just had your database on your phone. You wouldn't be able to interact with anybody, right? So the database has to be out there somewhere on the internet, which is the Facebook website, right? So they expose an API, which the app then uses
I see.
in order to be able to get to all the data. So actually pretty much all our Android apps at some point connect to an API.
Yeah, because I was just on the Wikipedia and it said something like 5 billion people use it for networks.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I guess.
Well, that's probably just the login part of it. Of the
Yeah.
API. But
Yeah.
But yeah, they have pretty much any app that you have is going to have an API, because what that allows us to do is if we write the API once, now we have all that functionality and all the back-end functionality. Now every single front end, whether it's an Android app or an iPhone app, or it's running on your smart TV, all of those things can connect to that same API. So it saves us a lot of work by putting all that stuff behind an API. And we can even use it for the website itself.
That's pretty cool. What time did you say I get that?
At 2:40. Yeah. Definitely take notes, because the recording won't really get the stuff on the whiteboard. But I am recording.
Do we need that first part?
Do what?
That first part we was talking about with the, that postman?
Postman, that tool? Yeah, we'll come back and use that in a short bit.
My computer.
Did you get installed already?
And my computer was acting really wonky, so I wasn't able to do anything, that's why I'm doing everything right now.
Okay. We'll come back to that tool in a minute once we actually have some services. Okay. So our goal here, we want to build a simple online shop, right? So we've created the project. We now need to create the database, right? So what tables do I need to add to that database?
A user table.
Okay, so let's say there's users. Okay, what else?
Chat messages.
Huh?
Chat messages.
Okay, I'm just gonna call them messages. Okay. What else?
Probably a one-to-many relationship between them.
Between those two? Which direction does it go? You said, okay, so that would be that direction. Okay. Evan, you had a hand up?
I was gonna say that, but maybe you could have like a user settings table. If that's how you, if you wanted to go that far.
What would that include?
Well, the user would have like information about, you know, username, password, maybe their name,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, there could be other settings that you want to specify if it's like a more advanced application, like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know,
Yeah,
if you had like an audio feature, you could like
yeah. I'm gonna leave that out because I
Yeah.
want to make this as simple as possible.
right.
I want to make this as simple as possible. Fewer tables, the better.
Different rooms.
You might have rooms. How would a room be related to those other items that are already on the board?
One room, many users.
Okay, so one room may have many users.
But users can also be a part of many rooms.
Okay. What about rooms and messages?
Messages are already linked to users.
But I don't know what room these messages were written in.
One
Dalton, you
room
had
could
it?
have many messages.
Huh?
One room would have many messages.
Yeah. What about the other way around? What's this?
Messages could only be a part of one room.
Right. If I send a message, I'm only sending it in one room. It shouldn't show up in all the rooms. It should only show up in one room. But that room can have as many messages at once. If I don't have that link, then my messages, I have no way to track which room the message was posted in. That make sense? And that means whatever message you post shows up in all the rooms. And that would defeat the point of having multiple rooms, right?
Maybe a profile picture.
You could have a profile picture. I could include that just in the users table directly, right? I could. Or I could say, well, bring that over here and say profile picture. Or user picture.
Maybe message attachments if it allows you to put files on messages. So you could have, so messages could have multiple files attached to them.
Okay. So you could say attachments.
Yeah.
Before I get to that, what's the relationship between these two things?
One user would just have one profile.
Okay. And every profile picture only belongs to one user.
I've seen some services where instead of being able to use your own profile picture, you have to select from a list that already exists.
Okay. Let's assume you're uploading one.
Okay.
Let's assume you're uploading. So if you were saying attachments, they would live over here. And they'd be linked to the message. What's the link to the message?
Message could have many attachments.
Okay.
Attachments only belong to one message.
Yep, that makes sense. That's a reasonable assumption. It's not a cost-saving assumption, but it's a reasonable assumption. Because it could mean I have the same file uploaded a bunch of times.
Shouldn't there be like a user role
I probably wanna have some sort of role, yeah. So, but you kind of jumped a step, right? User role.
Yeah.
Don't I need to list the
The
roles first?
Yeah.
Right? So
And-
I need to start with roles
Yes.
and then somehow combine them.
Yeah, the users, so you can do this multiple ways. You could say users can only have one role, but that's never really the case, I feel like.
That's not a good assumption. You
Right.
can make that assumption, but I would say that's always a bad thing to make because it will lead you into code that's eventually gonna have to change.
Right.
So that's one where I always jump into the assumption that users can have multiple roles because there's just too many reasons why you would need that.
Mm-hmm.
So if I say user roles, where is that one connected to?
The user has, one user could have many user roles.
Okay, a user can have many user roles. Why is that?
Because that user could need to do many different things that require different roles.
Okay, so they might have this role, or they might have more than one.
So then
Right.
every user
But these
role-
are linked back to
Yeah.
one user,
Okay.
right? Okay, and what about roles? Is roles connected in here as well?
Yes.
Okay. So a user, so a role could belong to multiple users, right? Multiple users could have the same role. I could have multiple admins, I could have multiple channel admins, or whatever I want to call them. I could have multiple people at that. But for any given user role record, that only goes back to one role. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Wouldn't you need to do the same thing for users and rooms?
Yes, yes. You see that? There's a many to many here, right? So we break that up. Okay. So I have there, and I have a room has many users. That's the way your bridge table's going to be. Now, here's a trick. Here's kind of a catchy, a trick question that not everybody thinks about. User roles. Are those the only two tables that should be connected to?
No.
Okay.
But it should also be connected to rooms.
Why?
Because roles could be specific to certain rooms.
Right. So I might be an admin on this room, but I might not be an admin on the other room. Right? So if I link that together, I'm going to say, okay, that permission goes with one room. I can have multiple users there.
Guessing there would be a way though in user roles to.
Now, here's a problem here. Now, if I do that now, I've said, I've got the room ID here, I've got the user ID, and I've got the role ID. But note that I have the user ID and the room ID in that table, right? That's duplicated over here. Does that make sense? That's duplicated over here. This has the user ID and the room ID. This has the user ID and the room ID. So now I'm keeping track of what users are in the room twice.
So you should connect them.
No.
You should use user.
You should have, okay.
User roles should be
User
the bridge table.
Let's kill that
between-
table. Right?
Yeah.
Let's kill that table. And maybe give this table a better name. And this is where, okay, usually what we do, right, is we combine the table, combine the three names. But user room roles, user role rooms, I don't think any of those are particularly great names. I mean, the one that's probably best is user room role, but that's not a great name. So what could I call it instead?
User role information or something like that.
Which of these three tables, which are the two most important?
Users and roles.
Why that?
Well, obviously the user, I mean, that kind of drives the entire,
Okay, user's
relationship.
obvious.
But the role is most important, more important, I'd say, because the way it's set up, a user can have multiple. The way the room will function is dependent on the role that the user has.
Okay.
So the line of importance should
Okay.
go.
Anybody else? Anybody who's got a different opinion?
I think role is the least important because a user can still be part of the room and not have a role, but if the, like,
So typically the way we set that up, we would set as some sort of guest or regular user role. So typically everybody's gonna have a role. It's just that everybody starts at the same role. That make sense?
yeah.
So everybody's gonna have a role in the system, and that makes it easier because I hate to deal with nulls there. It's actually easier to deal with giving them an ID and a roll number rather than dealing with null there. But you're saying it's least important, but why is that?
To be honest, the reason why is because I was thinking there could be nulls there,
Okay,
or users without roles.
yeah. You could implement it that way. I would say it's better not to implement it that way. Because that makes your software more complicated. It's actually easier to have a role name in there than to not have one. Well, think about it this way. Let's say I'm joining this chat room, right? The first thing when I go into that room, am I picking my role? I'm not picking my role initially. That'll probably happen. I'm promoted later, right? I join the room and at some point somebody promotes me to room admin or something, right? The other thing that matters there, can I be more than one role in a particular room?
Yes.
Okay. Think so? So what might be an example of that where I'm more than one role in a given room?
Like, I've been on chat rooms that have where multiple users can have multiple roles, but it's mostly for aesthetic purposes.
I was gonna, yeah. I was
That's
gonna
more
kinda-
like badges.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were gonna say?
I don't really have an answer to your original question,
Yeah.
but I feel like the functionality of the rules in this database are based on permissions, or would be based on like permissions, right? And every higher role you have, you also have the preceding role's permissions, so there's no point in having multiple
Which is
roles.
typically how it's set up. Yeah. That's the easy way to set things up, is where there's just an escalation of here's level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of thing. So yeah, so usually you're only gonna have one role. And so in the way that I think about that, that would make it legitimate still if I wanted to call this table user rooms. That still kind of would make sense.
Yeah.
If I assume that users can only have one role per room, that's still a legal name to put there. Or the other way I could put it is maybe say, call this some sort of membership, right?
Well, something that I was just thinking of is would you need to have duplicate rows to have the same user and room combination to have multiple roles? So,
That's what I was saying.
yeah,
That doesn't really, whether or not they can have that actually doesn't so much matter as far as the columns are concerned. Like, it'll still have those 3 columns. The question is, the way I would enforce that, whether they can have one role or multiple roles, is just by putting what we would call a unique constraint on there. That's all I would need. Or I could say room members would be one way to write that. But that's where, once you start putting 3 tables in there, you have to usually start going back to the drawing board and saying, is there a better name for this? Does that make sense?
Just in general, when you have a many-to-many relationship between tables, is it common or is it common to have like a bridge table in between to?
It's required.
Okay.
In terms of a relational database, many-to-many relationships are not allowed. You have to turn them into, you have to put a bridge table there.
Okay.
That doesn't exactly exist on the NoSQL world. In the NoSQL world, you can actually have a many-to-many relationship, and it's okay. You don't have to have a bridge table. But things will work different in that world. So, but in this world of tables, we have to have that bridge. So, let's say we've got that. There might be some other things in here. There might be some friends, right? We built this big schema, okay? So that's obviously not something we're going to build in one day, right? So in the industry, we have a term that we call minimum viable product. What's the smallest thing that you can build and deliver value to your customers? And build that first. And then kind of ramp up from there, right? So there's an elaborate network of stuff that's up here, right? Which of these tables do we absolutely have to have in order to build a chat room?
Messages.
Okay. I definitely have to have messages. Are there any other tables I have to have?
I mean, everyone could just be anonymous, and then you wouldn't need a user table.
You should have a room, like a global room. I mean,
Only if I'm going to assume I have more than one room,
well,
right? If I only have one room, I don't need a rooms table,
that's fair, yeah.
right? So again, minimum viable product, what's the minimum that we can build and make it work? So let's start with one room, right? So if I only have one room, one chat room, I don't need that table. I obviously don't need attachments to start with. I don't have to have these because these are connected to like permissions and such. I don't have to have profile pictures to start with. But you're right, do I have to have users? Well, I have to have users if I want the users to be able to log in and I want to track who's who, right?
Yeah, if everyone is just anonymous, you don't need users.
Right. If everybody's a guest and there's no username password combinations, there's no registration process, then I just have messages. Does that make sense? If everybody's basically anonymous, then I just need messages. So that's all I'm going to start with. I'm just going to start with messages. Keep that in the back of your mind because that's not a bad thing to build, and I might actually turn that into an assignment at some point.
Can I take a picture of it then?
Go for it.
I'll send it to you.
Just send it to Discord.
Okay.
Because that's not a bad assignment as far as taking this and building on it. but I'm just going to start with a message because that's going to keep it as simple as possible. So I'm going to create a new table. I'm going to call it messages. Okay. So those messages need to have an ID. They need to have an actual, they need to have some actual text to them. And maybe I say that they're limited to 140 characters. I may also want to track what user sent it, but really just by their name. So I want to know what user sent it, what they sent. I don't want it to be completely anonymous because I don't want it to just say message, message, message. I want to be able to say, okay, well, these users are the same user. So at some point I'm probably going to just build a simple login screen with just give me your username and you're in. So I want that as a basic setup. Is that enough? If I just have that, do I have enough?
Do you want like a time of message?
I absolutely have to have a time message. Why do I absolutely have to have the time?
So you can set that, order by.
So I can order them, right? So if I don't have that time, then I can't properly order them by when the messages were sent.
Idea I have is maybe another reply, nullable reply to, if this is so you can reply to other messages and it'll know to be associated with them.
So remember I just said minimum viable product.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Not a bad feature. Minimum viable product is what I'm going to say to that.
So let's just be primary key identity.
So here's one thing I'm going to change about that, though. Okay. As far as a chat room is concerned, how big do you think this table's going to get?
Pretty large.
Pretty large, right? People send a lot of messages. And there's going to be a lot of inserts happening on this table, right? So this is a really, really bad place to use my primary key identity in this kind of table. This is probably the worst case to choose primary key identity. And because the identity means that, okay, it's going to try to make them ascending, which means every time you try to insert a new record, it's got to wait a little bit to give you the next number, which is going to slow down how fast this can run. And it also means that there's kind of maybe some predictability to the IDs. So what I'm going to do, because especially that may then be a privacy problem once I go throw this up as some sort of REST API where you can just guess the ID, I'm going to actually start by making this a GUID.
That's what I was thinking, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah. Or no, it's not it's unique. So this is a really, really, really good place to use that. It's one of the best places to use that. Same thing with comments. Comments, you get a lot of comments. likes, you get a lot of likes. Ratings, you get a lot of ratings. So anything like that where you have a lot of data coming into that.
So in the model, how would you write that out?
It'll be system GUID.
Okay.
And so I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the type I'm going to use here. Okay. So let's push that out. So I'm going to right click the project. I'm going to say publish. I'm going to make this Chatterbox as the database. I'm going to save this profile as into the published folder. I'm going to call it localhost.publish.xml.
Install Chatterbox again.
Okay, there we go. Problem solved. Save profile. All right, so I've saved that as localhost.publish.xml. I'm going to generate that script, and we're going to go ahead and get a database there.
Saved it as localhost.publish.
Yep. Localhost.publish.xml. And I saved that into that publish folder. Okay. Run the script and we're good. Okay. So that's the table that we've defined. I'm going to now go over to the actual web application. We're going to build those models. So I'm going to say add to here. I'm actually going to not use I'm not going to use that wizard to build this up because I want to make sure we get some more experience with just building that from scratch. So I'm just going to create a class, and I'm going to call that Chatterbox database. Oh, yep. I don't know why I want to put one T in there.
Maybe because just chat normally has one T.
That's probably why. Okay, so we're going to create that database. It needs to be a subclass of DB context. Yeah, we got to bring in MD framework, right? I can't import it because I haven't done that yet. But actually, notice here under the suggestions, notice it even says find it. It says go ahead and install it. I'm actually just going to use that. So find and install the latest version. Okay. So we got Entity Framework installed. I've got my DB context here. I need some model. Let me go ahead and just add a constructor in there. So public. There. Okay. So I want to add. Another add a class for that table. So I'm going to say add class. And we're going to add the message class. So public GUID. Let me pull this off to the side so I remember what I've called the tables. What I've called the columns. So ID get set. This is the key. And this is table messages. So I've got the ID, I've got the user, so public string user get set required string length 20.
For the Chatterbox database, did you use the entity data model?
You said what?
For the Chatterbox database, did you use the entity data model?
No, it's a subclass of DB context.
Oh.
I just created this as a class. I'm just creating classes directly rather than using the wizard. And then this one would be the sent date. So this would be date, time, nullable, sent.
Don't you need to put a required on it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's how that works out. So if I put unique identifier on the schema, that's going to turn into GUID over here in the C# world. The other important thing to remember, identity only works if your primary key is an int, right? So if I marked this as identity, I would actually get a syntax error. You wouldn't be able to work with that, or I should get in the syntax error, because that's not, there it is, that's not valid. In order for it to be identity, it has to be an integer. So that's going to give me very random IDs. Okay, so I have a message table. I need to go back here. I need to add that DB set. So public virtual DB set message. Okay, so that's our model defined. Okay, if I stop here, can I connect to the database? Why not?
You're missing a connection string.
Missing the connection string. So let's go through and set this up. And this is part of why I didn't want to go through the designer, because I wanted to make sure that we covered this part as how to do it by hand. So connection strings. I'm going to say add name of that. The name of that, remember, has to be the same thing as our DB context. So it's going to be Chatterbox database no dot. Okay. Now, if I wanted it to be a different name, what could I do? If I instead wanted to call this, say, Chatterbox, what would I need to do?
You have to change the name of the model?
You mean the name of the DB context?
Yeah.
I could do another route. And remember the base class takes some parameters, and if you do the generation, it will generate it that way. But I can say name equals chatter box. So if for some reason I want to change the name of that connection string, I can change it that way. So now it should be going off of the chatterbox connection string. So let's finish up the connection string. What parts do I need to have in there? What three things do I need to specify?
Is it the local host?
Okay.
Integrity?
In the catalog,
Okay, something about catalog, yeah.
Initial catalog.
Initial catalog. Okay, that's one of them.
wasn't there, I don't know what the AWD name was, but it was, we defined it as integrated security.
Okay, that was the name of it.
Oh, okay.
Integrated security is one of them. What's that third one? Third one is where you need to put localhost, where you need to put server name. What's the third one? Remember I posted a handout on that.
Provider name.
You're close. That's something else.
Data source.
Data source, maybe?
Data source. That's it. So data source is equal to localhost, the initial catalog is equal to what?
Chatterbox database.
How can we find out for sure what I need to name, what I need to have as the initial catalog? How can I prove that how can I make sure that I'm putting the right thing in there?
Isn't it the name of the project?
Don't rely on the name of the project.
Can you check your publish file?
I could check my publish file, yes. That'd be a good way. Another way for me to check, assuming I've published it already. So if I go to view, open up the SQL Server Object Explorer, I can actually go look under localhost here and see what databases I have out there. So I can see the database that's out there. What is it called? It's called Chatterbox, right? So that's the database that already exists. And yes, I could go to my publish file and look here at that field and find it out. Definitely do not rely on the name of the project. That will lead you astray so many times. You rely on the name of the project to be the name of the database. I've seen that be something else. Like for instance, what's the name of our database for Learn to Earn? I think it's Learn to Earn LTE-MVC. Something. Anyway, it's not the name of the project. That happens a lot.
How did you get to localhost on the Server Explorer object?
So if it's not here, you see it's already here for me, so I'm going to disconnect. If it looks like this for you, you need to right click here up on SQL Server, say add SQL Server, and I'm going to type in localhost, pick Windows Authentication, and just pick any database here. So you may just have to add it if you don't have it already. Okay, so I know I've got the Chatterbox there. So I've got data source is localhost, initial catalog is Chatterbox, and integrated security is equal to true. And remember, that just means I'm using my Windows credentials to connect to it. Okay. I still need the provider name. or the provider. Yep, provider name. And what is that one? Do you have it open?
I don't.
Do you have the handout open?
The system.data.sql client.
That would be it. System.data.sql client. I really want you to get intimately familiar with that, because as soon as you go to start putting things on the internet, that's the thing that's going to cause you the most problems. Is that. So that needs to be a place that you're very quick to go look and very quick to understand what's going on there, because once we go to push things into the internet, that's going to be very important.
What does that do again, the provider name?
So the provider name tells it what class to use to actually connect to the database. So system.data.sql client, that effectively tells it that you're connecting to SQL Server. You're connecting to Microsoft SQL Server. If I was connecting to MySQL, that would be something else. If I was connecting to Oracle, it would be something else. SQLite, it would be something else. So it's what kind of database are you connecting to? And specifically, it's what class does it need to use to connect to that kind of database. Okay, so we've set up the connection string, we've set up the DB context, we've got a model. Now we should be able to just create a controller that can work with that. Okay, so I'm going to create a new controller under the controllers folder. I'm going to make it empty. And why don't I call this one the chat controller?
So did you build it yet?
Huh?
Don't you need to build it before you can add?
You're gonna make, acceptable range.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
So what I usually end up, what it seems to be, close all documents, close everything that's open, and then I'm going to do a build, clean solution, and build a rebuild. So that's the thing that seems to be the biggest fix, is the closing all the tabs actually. So I'm going to say add controller, and this is going to be the chat controller. Okay. I may also want some sort of account controller so that users can log in. So I'm going to add that as well. So I've got the account controller. The only method that I need on that is login. So I'm going to rename index over there to be login. I'm going to have maybe 2 versions of that. Or no, I'm just going to leave that as is. I'm just going to have that as a single login method there. Over on the chat controller side, so I'm going to leave the index there. I'm going to add this. I'm going to add a few methods. So, or I need to get to the database first. So, private chatterbox database underscore DB. So I want to connect to the database, and I want to have some way for the user to connect to these. I want to build these web services now. So the first web service I'm going to build is going to be one that's going to return all the messages. So public action results. get messages. Messages is equal to db. Oh, I may want that to be async. So let's do that real quick. Await db dot messages to list. Okay, so grab all the messages and then return JSON messages. Okay. Now, one thing I probably want to do in here is probably I want to sort them, right? What would be a sensible way to sort these messages?
By the time they're posted, oh, sorry.
By the time they're posted. Yeah. Because the thing to know, once I go into here and have widths, that unique identifier, they will now effectively be in a random order if I don't sort them. Because I don't get a nice, easy ascending order with like I would with an identity. So dot order by, and we want to say, actually order by descending. Okay. Now, common thing with messages, I always end up with you're always going to end up with a lot of messages. So if I just do this, I'm going to always be sending back all of the messages, right? I'm sending back all the messages. I probably just want to send a certain number of recent messages, right? So if I say order by descending, I'm already ordering it so the most recent ones are at the top. I can just say take, and maybe just take the top 1,000. That way I'm not getting too many messages. I'm only getting the 1,000 most recent messages. It's still a lot of messages, but at least then there's some upper limit, right? It does mean that my users aren't going to be able to go back farther in the history than that 1,000, but it means that I'm not displaying all of the messages all the time. You know, all the messages for eternity. Okay, so I've got one method to get the messages. Now, if we try to run this now, so we'll notice that we can't get to anything there yet because we haven't said anything in terms of routes. But I want to go to chat/get messages. And you see the message that I'm getting, right? This request has been blocked because sensitive information could be disclosed with a get, right? So remember, anytime you type a URL into the browser, it's going in as a GET request, right? So by default, for JSON responses, it turns off that GET. It turns off that being an option, right? And in fact, I really only want to allow this because I'm using that only take the top 1,000. I probably don't really want this to be cached because if I have this as get, they can be saved for that response can be saved for a certain amount of time, which means it won't always ask for the most recent messages. That makes sense? I want it to always ask for the most recent, get all the most recent messages. So I'm going to force this to have to be through post. Okay. Now, we know that typing in the URL, I'm going to get. Here I want to be able to test this as post. So what am I going to use? I'm gonna use that postman tool. Okay, so let's open it up. Make sure that you've made this change, make sure it's running, because we'll need to have it running in order to test it with Postman. So I already created a collection. I'm going to actually delete this one just to make sure I can show you how to do that. So I'm going to say new collection. We're going to call this collection Chatterbox. A collection is basically just a way to group together these requests that we're creating. So you can save them and have them grouped together by like what application they go with. All right, so I'm going to say add request. I don't know, I'll just go over here and close these. Okay, so I'm going to create a new request. And where do I want this to go? Well, if I look at, for me, this is going to be one thing, for you it's going to be another. Because notice that my port number is going to be different than yours, right? So what I want to put in there is HPS, localhost, port number, chat messages. Your port number is going to be different, okay? But that's what you want to put up there. I'm also going to change this over to post. And I'm going to hit send. And let me check that I'm running. 44377. Maybe try without the S.
Just give me a full square. I'm gonna try to.
Okay. So one thing here, it says self-signed certs are being blocked. Remember that we're running this locally, so there's a good chance that that is the case. So if I go up to, where is that? Settings, general. There, file settings, general. Okay. SSL certification verification. I'm going to turn that off. So that's the third checkbox from the top. And try it again. There it goes. Okay. So I sent it with that off. Now I'm getting just this. I'm getting an empty array, right? And is anybody not getting an empty array? Okay, that's fine. Go back to HTS. Yeah, there you go. Anybody else not getting that?
Yeah,
What
also
are you seeing right now?
getting cryptographic response.
Go to the file settings.
I just did.
Okay. All right. So go back and put that in.
Okay, yeah.
There it is.
see, no connections for any shower box.
So go back to, this is level 10.
So it's looking for one called Chatterbox.
Okay.
And these guys are just Chatterbox.
There. Where are you at?
Sorry. You should be able to pick up.
What did you do for this? What did I do?
So you have this. There's your chat. So it's an execute, make sure it's running.
So you should have over here, you should have
Elections.
That's what I heard. You're gonna deal with it.
Yeah, corrections.
Good. I have to get my.
Also, those cameras always been there.
No, they're new. So yeah. There's so many of them. You get every single angle. Nothing like it.
Was there a problem with the old ones?
I don't know. I think you only was one to do it. They can bother watching film or something. Does that seem to get you into the Bible? No.
Word of
No.
Which runs the whole series.
Yeah, it's terrible. So it's not even the whole game. I was gonna get on Friday the first game. And I was like, maybe we'll get ahead at some point. Maybe. And then like to the 8th inning before we got ahead.
Just try to
Brutal.
close this on.
I think they just gave up at this point.
Yeah, but if we come back and win the series,
Imagine that.
no, that's not gonna happen. Yeah, put the bat on the wall. Dude, you better look like the kids, like you know those clubs in college and high school that have the bullpens and they dress up in like you're like that was the encouraging people that they were bullpen about they dress up in like shattered gear and start fighting. It looks like sabers and red saber like wrestling. That's what the Cardinals look like right now. They're kind of straight up white saber all the time.
I don't know why yours is working. I don't know why.
Yeah, my goes for stuff.
Not anymore.
Not used to all the time.
I used to, yeah.
Oh, there you go.
I think I broke 3 times doing that.
That's so much fun. I only broke one. And I'm my first one. And it, it's coming about the crap out of it.
So-
And it never really.
I've had
One
this
day
for a
it
year.
fell
I
out.
haven't broken it yet, so I'm proud of
That's
this.
what I'm gonna say. Post.
That one?
No,
And
that
put
was-
in the.
those things are durable though. It's not missing. That thing hit walls in the ground, houses.
So just.
Copy that.
Hashtag applicates. Hashtag got it.
Never buy.
That's gonna be slash chat.
That's what happens, like, dude. Storm
Slash
slash.
messages. Okay.
They got me. This is a $40 case. I know.
$3 in my hands, I was like,
Okay.
no problem.
I got it right when I got it in the episode, like right when it came up.
So-
I'll make sure to drop it again. Cause I already dropped it in crack. I got it.
My girlfriend, she works at like this esthetician school or whatever. And she's like past like the school thing and she like works on the floor and like she does all the treatment stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But like you guys can just next to her making stuff before. So like everyone knows and she like Well, yeah, well, yeah, I know, but I was like fifth grade and I think I lived my parents, and my brother and sister like a spot. Then I got like one of those like head tattoos on my chest. But I felt like The Rock. My sister got like braids and shit. I don't know if you can do it actually. Oh, yeah, I told you. I used to play soccer. I used to play soccer with a bunch of instructors.
So add an instructor on there.
A bunch of like coaches. Put some like really like college guys. Those were my grandchildren. And so I can play with them.
Home base.
Good. He's the one that opened the place. So I was like, I heard that.
And this is not a set class.
And then Ben's like, oh man. And so it's like this guy like that in the feet. You're doing the classic on the feet. That doesn't describe anything.
So I'm going to say base, in there you need parentheses, and it's going to be
The play post.
name is equal to chapters. That tells it what the name is.
Hey, how's it going? My shoes on.
And then you some curly braces.
There you go.
As you can start, try to run it.
Listen to the picture. Listen to the devil. When you do that? 26. It's I think it's a Saturday. Today's my birthday actually.
So, yeah, try it.
Or not actually.
That's what you want to be. Okay. So what I'm seeing here now, right? So I'm seeing these square brackets. I'm seeing an empty array. And that means, okay, it's working, but there's no data in the database, right? So we really want to test this and make sure it works. So let's go ahead and put some data in the database. I'm just going to put 3 messages in there, but that should be enough. The way I'm actually going to go about that, I'm just going to go directly into the SQL Server Object Explorer where we were a minute ago. On the left, I'm going to go to the Chatterbox database, tables. I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to say view data. So I'm going to actually put it in directly here.
Why did you add a new line like that? Enter?
Just enter. So yeah, so
How did you get to that window?
SQL Server Object Explorer, that's the view you want to open. You're going to go to localhost, down to Chatterbox, down to the table, and you're going to right click that and say view data.
Okay.
So you can do it this way. This is directly in Visual Studio, or you can do it through Management Studio. That's up to you. 10/15/2019.
When you get to the Chatterbox server, what folder is it in? Table, and then
Yeah, tables. Oh, one thing I need to do, I'm going to hit escape on this to get out of here, because it's not automatically giving me IDs. So this is not something you have to do, but I would recommend going back and doing it because it's going to make our life easier. So if we go back to the messages table, you'll notice I put a default in here for the, I put a default in for the date time, which means it's automatically going to pick up the current date and time if I leave that empty. I also want to have it automatically generate an ID for me if I leave that empty.
isn't that what I thought the unique identifier?
Huh? No, unique identifier is just the data type. So I'm going to make this default new ID. and that's going to make it easier to insert data.
Should we do that anytime we use unique identifier?
Yes, I would recommend that. If it's a primary key, then do that. If it's not a primary key, then don't do that. Okay, so I published that, and let me try that again. So view data, foo, bar, yay, okay. So that means I don't have to fill in the other two things, it'll just automatically figure them out.
I have 3 local host options. In my,
Uh-huh.
I don't know which one to use.
It may not matter, but I can take a look at it.
I got an error when publishing.
So here, no, only one of these is localhost. So these two are local DB. That is different.
Okay.
Local DB is kind of a stripped down version of SQL Server that's built into Visual Studio. But my experience is it doesn't work. I just skip over that. Okay, thank you. Those are in there.
I thought it was supposed to automatic.
Okay. So I added a few messages here. You can see I hit refresh once I did that, so I could see all the data. And you can see that it's automatically filled in the times, figured out those as different times, it's automatically filled in those GUIDs. So speaking of GUIDs, you can see this is what they look like. GUIDs, unique identifier. They're fairly long. They look like a random sequence of characters. That's what they're supposed to be. What we call globally unique, there's kind of 2 names for them. We call them globally unique identifiers. That would be GUIDs. They're also sometimes called UUIDs, or universally unique identifiers. They're basically the same thing. The whole idea, though, is that they're long enough that for every ID here, there are fewer atoms in the earth than the number of IDs that you can have here. So the likelihood of you getting the same ID twice is pretty low, is very, very low, which is nice. But that's why that's so long, is we want to make the likelihood of collision to be really, really, really small.
I also don't, I just want to say I don't like that the font isn't monospace.
Sorry. Tell Microsoft you had a hand up. You just have to refresh so that you get the full values. So if you have that data in there, go back to Postman and see what you get. See if that works. Just hit refresh on the top left. You can't put a graphic text in there. Try to get you have a page
What did
you
you
made
do?
this. Here's where they publish it.
Yeah, the day shows up in an odd way. But hey man,
Not did my
they can't kind of do it wrong. We'll figure it out.
Why is the date so weird?
You did that part. I think you just needed to close
this window after we make that change. To escape.
Yeah, that's fine. You can just ignore that. That's not a problem. Huh? Okay. It's not actually null.
Okay, she's showing
It's
that.
not actually null. As soon as you refresh it, it will go away. The version that was associated with this one.
It's already
I'm not sure. Any instrumental.
Okay, so
The last time I did an instrumental was grade school. It was the flute. Or not the flute, the recorder.
Ranking choir.
Choir was yeah, my dad's a choir teacher, so that worked with me. Yeah, at first I didn't, but I ended up really liking it. I did like all these like acapella groups and stuff.
Grade class.
What did you sing? Like read a tenor or you sing both?
I started half the baritone. But if I wore my tight white side.
I was gonna say, it wasn't so great. I sing a soprano part for competition. Oh, we got first, baby. I sing like a girl and she sang alto. But to be fair, I could also sing baritone. I was wondering, I don't have that
It's
range.
easy for guys that sing that high. You just go to your falsetto.
I can't sing well.
I know, I could maybe hit the notes, but I sound like a screeching monkey.
My 7th, 8th grade teacher was also transitioning. This time the parts that I could sing. Good thing.
I played cello in middle school.
I found cello and like other string instruments.
Saxophone is cool too. I had it picked up. Maybe saxophone, maybe clarinet. Really cool.
Saxophone's so complicated, so many weird things.
That's what I thought too, but I found it easier than.
That's the one that you're like.
No, saxophone's like
Oh,
I think
yeah,
it's
it curves up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're not. You go trombone.
Oh.
Yeah, trumpets is like.
Yeah, Trump.
Oh, that's more.
So David
It's
Chapman.
not basic.
Saxophone. You watch Parks and Rec and that one? Ron Swanson.
Oh, yeah.
That's what Ron Swanson
Yeah.
did.
I'm really David just actually so much.
How did you see him? Richie Alcott was not Parks and Rec.
That's what's happened. Twice. I couldn't do it.
What's he good at? Like the first thing is good. That's what I heard. It gets settled in itself.
Once Ben and Chris come on,
Yeah.
that season 3,
Oh,
that's when
yeah.
it's really good.
Is who? Chris Pratt?
Yeah. Oh, not
No, he's in all the way, but
Oh, he's in the whole.
when Rob Lowe and Adam Scott come on the show,
Okay.
next season 3.
Yeah.
Reminds me of The Office, but like,
Honestly, the ending of Parks and Rec is so much better.
Yeah.
I hated that show.
I felt like The Office didn't want to end the way they were forced to, so they was like, okay.
Well, they were Parks and Rec was smart. When people started leaving, they said, "Hey, we're gonna end the show." But they tried to make it one when Michael Scott and that one big brother. It's not as good.
Okay. So back here in Postman. So I send that. You can see what's coming back. So I can see all the different messages. I can see their username. I can see their text. I can see what this date is coming back as. And I can definitely see that while it's not necessarily formatting it in a nice way, I can see that it's giving me, okay, this number is lower than that number is lower than that. Right? So let me try something to see if I can get the date to come back in maybe a little bit more of a user-friendly manner. So let's see, if I go to I'll close all these. I'm going to go to the message. And I'm going to say data type. So this is a date time. And display format. Let's see, if I display this as data format string. Okay. Data format string. And let's say year dash DD, or no, month, day, hour, minute, second. The capitalization there is important, by the way.
And the other colons don't interact with the first one, I guess.
That's a good question, but if I remember right now.
Like the colon says basically format to start the format string. So how would the other colons?
You're what?
So could the other colons mess with it?
I believe that it figures it out. I could be wrong, but I think that's going to figure it out. Notice that I have an uppercase M here at the beginning. That's month. Lowercase m is minute. Uppercase H is in a 24-hour clock. If you do lowercase h, that will be a 12-hour clock. What were you saying, Evan?
I just said I was really blind.
Yeah.
Is that a 0 at the beginning?
Yes, that's a 0 at the beginning. Yeah. So let's run, I'm going to run that real quick. I don't know if this will do what I want it to, but I'm going to give it a try. Yeah, so that still didn't do what I wanted it to.
This is the number, the amount of seconds since January 1st, 1970.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. So, one thing I may want to do while I'm here, though, the other change I made is still potentially valuable because I may want to do some stuff with it later. But what I want to do here, I'm going to hit save. And what I want to do is add that to the Chatterbox collection. So I'm going to pick that from down here like that. So save the Chatterbox. So you should see under your Chatterbox collection, you should see this here now. The nice thing about that is now it's saved, so you can go run it anytime you need to. Bring that back up. Okay. Yeah, so it doesn't appear to have applied that in there. Now, what I could do is I could change how the chat controller works to return that differently. I'm going to just leave that as is for the moment because I think it may end up working out when I get back to the JavaScript side. So that's a method to get the messages, right? What's a very important other piece of functionality I'm going to need if I want to set up a chat room? So I can get messages. I also need to be able to what? Post messages, right? So I might put another one in here, public async task. I also want to mark this HTTP post. Let's call this send message. Now here's a good question. What should I take as the input to this method?
A message object.
Should take a message object. Okay, that's a reasonable assumption. So if I take a message, I can then say db.messages.add the message, and then save the changes. Now, I probably want to make sure that they can't do anything they want. Well, I may want to do that. I could do that this way. The reality is, though, I don't really want them to be able to give me all of these inputs, right? I could do that. I don't want them to really have free reign on those fields, right? So I really only want them to be able to give me 2 of those things. So instead of actually taking a model here, I'm just going to take those 2 items that I want to allow them to give me. So user string text. So that way I can build up my own model and have it be the way I want it to be. So let's say that the ID is GUID, new GUID. The user is equal to user. The text and sent is equal to date time now. So that way I know for sure the only things that the user can send me are those 2 values, and that's it.
Don't you not have to set the ID because it should do it automatically?
No, I do actually need to set it in this case. I didn't need to set it in SQL. I do need to set it in Entity Framework, as it turns out. So new GUID, GUID.newGUID, that will generate a random GUID. So that's what that's there about, is to generate a random GUID. I still need to return something. And what I want to return to the user, I need some way for them to know that it's been successful. Okay? So usual way that I would set this up, you can set it up any way you want. But the usual way I set this up is to return an object. So I might say success is equal to true, and message is equal to message sent. That can really be anything, but the general good rule of thumb is you want to return a Boolean, yes or no, and you want to return a message of some sort. That way there's a descriptive kind of explanation of what happened, as well as a, hey, I can run code off of that Boolean, if that makes sense. Because I could do it as well, message empty means there's not a problem, or things like that, but that generally results in problems at some point.
Would you put that in a try catch?
I could put that in a try catch, yeah. So if I was going to put this in a try catch, where would I start the try?
Would it be when you save the changes in the database?
So put it here.
I mean, ideally, you'd want it to be like when the user is sending a message, right? So when they send a message, it's.
I
This
would
be when you add the message.
I would recommend having it here.
Yeah.
Here's a good place. You could also even put it all the way up at the top. Either of those are valid options. But I would definitely put the add in the try.
So what could go wrong potentially when we're adding the message?
So one thing that could happen is the database server could just be offline. The connection string could be wrong. The schema could be different than the model. Need I go on?
No, you're good.
Something could be duplicated where I have I could have a mismatch on my foreign keys or breaking a unique constraint. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So, and I can't feasibly anticipate all of those. Most of those are going to be out of my control. So in that case, I might say return, and I'm going to say return JSON new success new. Actually, I might say return. Shoot. No, that's not what I wanted.
HTTP status code result.
Yeah. That's what I want. And I want a 500 error. What did they find? What? Oh, that's, I think it's internal. Yeah, internal server error. So that's going to give me back a 500 error if there's a problem. The upside of that is that means that's going to go into our fail handler when we're working with AJAX. So if something's wrong there, that's going to be the case. Yep.
Okay, so when I do the HTTP status code, it automatically generates a system.net.http status code.
Yeah, you just remove that and then add the using. I did the same thing up here. So it should look something like that. Okay, and the upside though, note this does allow me then, hey, to write some logs here. For instance, if something went wrong. So for instance, I might want to say debug show potential fix it. There we go. Debug dot write line, and I might want to say error the upside of doing that is then it lets me go back later and see that in the log and then fix it down the line. Does that make sense? So that's a general helpful rule. If you're going to write a try-catch, always you want to log it somewhere so that you can actually go back and find out that it happened. So let's say I have that there. Okay. We'll run this, and then we want to test this in Postman. So I'm going to go back to Postman. I'm going to add a new thing here. Send message.
This is no one.
Yep, this would be a new one. Remember, I need to change that to post. Now, if I try to send this as is, you should get a 500 error, right? Okay, because remember, I haven't set the actual username or the text of the message that's being sent, right? So right now, neither of those things are being included. So in order to fix that, I need to go under here. You see it says query parameters. So the first one's going to be user. You need to give it a value, and the second one would be text, and this would be my message of some sort.
So you need to set user and text.
Yes, down in the
The other one's the column level.
What's one of the bigger ones too?
Don't rub it in, Alex. Come on.
This is going listening.
The model you want to do.
I don't need to.
I know what a model is. You have to sit there and.
Yeah, it'd be really hard. I don't know. I just have to guess.
Yeah, I get projected. It's perfect.
Kind of question that is
Question
right.
you're gonna just ask.
Hi.
It's data points, for example. Screen reading.
Hello. Scoot your TV. We do need to go to the freaking.
Friday.
Rolling, Charlie Bush and Bush Congress actually.
That would be just good.
Have you heard of the one meeting?
No.
It's on the news, and it's like, this has all these like crazy rooms. Like tricky and stuff. It's like a quarter and and like the fair kind of crazy houses.
Go to the collection.
So we want to go to that, so we're just gonna take a train up there.
We'll call it Chatterbox.
You already done? Wow.
We're doing that, and then.
No.
You did move. Oh.
Wait, so if we go to get that question, are we gonna get, does he get that message? Really, did he? Check it for me. Go to get that message.
When are we gonna send it?
No, did you not save the request?
Which one?
The get message request.
No.
Well, save that, save this one first. Yeah, and then.
Which one to send the user text and body to the query sheet?
Yeah, I don't know, that's what I was thinking.
No, I didn't get it.
Yeah, I did. Do you not save the first one?
No, I didn't say the first one.
to your new message? Oh, you foobarred it. Is that the one you just sent?
No.
Is that the one you just sent?
Yeah, yes.
So it's
Did do it.
No, actually, I don't know what that was.
yeah, I'll check it on my own though.
Yeah.
Obviously useless.
Check on your own, you can possibly bug it.
Yeah, it does. So it actually goes into the database.
But also, I wonder if that could just be the time established by like the date kind of thing.
Yeah, you just have to.
Stuff. Like whenever they go
So why would you have the data be sent in a query stream instead of a
So if you, well, it can be either, right? It can be either. It would be better to have it maybe sent as the body, in which case you just go over here into body. I think form data, yeah. So if you want to set it as, you can just uncheck those. If you wanted to go over here to body, that would be, yeah, that would be the other way to do it.
So they work like both ways around.
Yeah, it works both ways. This would be probably the preferable way, you're right, is to put it in as in the body. Yes, Jeffrey, not Jeffrey, ugh.
Oh, yeah.
Jeremy.
I'm getting the 404 error, right?
You're getting a 404 error?
Yeah.
Make sure you hit execute in Visual Studio.
Okay.
And then see if that might not be the reason, but give that a try.
Wait, so if we do it through Postman, it doesn't seem to edit the database, right?
What do you mean?
When I tried to send post request through Postman, and it didn't
Okay.
update the server.
So I did send message, right?
Yeah.
When I go back to get messages, there's the message I just sent. Coming back. So yes, it should be changing the database.
Okay, now it's showing.
Okay, you might have to hit that refresh button in the top left corner for it to get to show.
Okay, this tab. Okay, now certain data that was missing is there now.
Okay. So happening. Oh, you're on get, that's why. Yeah.
Okay.
Hold on, let me do this. So let's come here. Make sure that's fine.
Never really attempted to.
It's like no, girl, not him.
So one thing to definitely do, because it's just telling you internal server, let's
Like, we got to out of here.
let's see what that
They can talk about that.
We'll ask. Let's see Bob, let's see his look in. See how he's doing.
So if I have
Oh, I guess he couldn't afford it.
No, I'm saying you did. You said you had, I think you said you had lost.
Yeah. So he's ignorant.
I think.
Oh, he's
You were not supporting data source. The premise? Spell. SORC.
Oh, you can't be
It's your workplace.
I wonder what that is.
So you that's not pretty about that. SOR.
I think it was in the home.
This is super important. They still have a problem somewhere.
I mean, like, last 6 years it was really good with you and fall behind. If you straight that right side, you actually got this.
Otherwise you can't see the lyrics. Really? Yeah. So you're not gonna do this until the end of it?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's where I'm at now.
Okay. So we've got it. So we've got a service that we can post messages. We've got another service we can use to get all the recent messages, right? So the next thing we can do, we've got an API there. Do we need anything else with our API? Do we need any other services? Huh?
Like you get a specific message, maybe?
Not really. I mean,
Well, wasn't that part of the RESTful API that you had drawn up?
it was. That is part of the RESTful API. I don't really need it here, right? Again, I'm going to go with minimum viable product. Now, I could.
What if you go over 1,000?
What if I go over 1,000? Well, that's a good question.
Let's try it.
What if I just say, what's an easier way to test that? Let me just say 2. Because I'm already over 2, right? So if I just change that to 2, that becomes very easy to test because I can just use the one that I have already. And I can see last 2 messages, right? So I'm going to go ahead and move that back up to 1,000, but that becomes an easy way to test that. What were you specifically saying if you're, what were you saying if you're over 1,000?
No, I'm saying, yeah, if you're over 1,000 and you can't really get to the next message because
Right.
you're over 1,000.
I'm saying you could, and you could use paging there, right? So like I could say int page is equal to 1, right? And do skip and take, just like we're familiar with. So I could do that. I just add parameters and do paging, just like we're familiar with. But it becomes relatively simple because then I could just say page size or maybe I make that just 100, and then I just say page size. Right. Okay. So I guess we'll finish up the rest of this tomorrow, because the next thing really that we need to do is to throw a UI on this, is to build out those views that actually talk to it. But I hope what you can see is that all this back-end stuff here that we're doing with these web services, it's the same as what we've done so far, right? So the back end doesn't change a lot just because we go over to web service and go over to AJAX. It's the front end that changes. So if you can understand that back end well, it'll help you towards doing this.
They're weird buttons.